Watercolor is known for its luminosity. It has captivating, light, bright, and translucent qualities, and making a watercolor painting is calming. It's the perfect way to unwind and relax. And art school admissions counselors love seeing watercolor paintings in your art portfolio. That's why we've developed an online program where you can learn watercolor techniques like learning how to describe volume, light, and texture at your own pace. The watercolor curriculum begins with experimenting with the consistency of watercolor pigments by making 3 swatches per color from a full pigment layer to a light wash layer, using a flat brush covering the swatches, continuing the process for all the colors listed. You may wonder why this color swatch exercise is so important for watercolor painting. This exercise lets you better understand the pigments you have, each pigment's coverage, and staining power on the watercolor paper you work on. Having a chart lets you make better color choices with a full understanding of each pigment's characteristics as you paint with them. Then you'll learn one of the most basic watercolor techniques, how to paint gradients using different levels of value, using dark and saturated colors like blue and red, to see the full range of value and tint level, making 5 different levels of value, starting with dark value strokes and adding water little by little to your previous paint to dilute the pigment slowly until it becomes clear water towards the end of the gradient. Once you've completed the exercises where you learn to control the values of watercolor, you'll use the knowledge of value differences to learn various ways to create 3-dimensional space and depth on 2-dimensional paper. The first color depth exercise will let you observe how different value shape sizes can create depth. First, by layering a light wash on all 5 circles with the lightest red tone. For this exercise, you'll use a sense of distance to create depth. Through this exercise, you'll get familiar with the proper way to load your brush and layer paint evenly on the surface. When you've successfully completed the exercise, you will see how the sense of distance can create depth. The mountains that are closer to you would be bigger and darker with saturated colors, but mountains that are far from you will have smaller shapes with faded colors. The third color depth exercise with green will show you how to create the illusion of height with the use of different values. When you finish this exercise, you will move on to the last color depth exercise. The fourth color depth exercise with brown shows how you can create a visual illusion of surface curving inward further from you. Then you'll create a monochromatic still life. For the monochromatic still life exercise, you'll use blue paint to make the lightest wash on the palette with enough water. Closely observing exactly where the highlights are placed and using the tip of your brush to draw them. Then doing a light wash covering the entire sketch except for the highlights. When you're finished with the first light wash, you'll go on to the next layer. In this monochromatic still life, you'll combine and use all the skills you learned in the previous exercises. Layering to make shadows, controlling the fluidity of your brush, and adding details. Once you've completed the monochromatic painting of a still life, you'll create a color chart where you'll experiment with 2 different ways to mix colors with watercolor. The left chart will pre-mix the colors on the palette before you put it on the paper, and the right chart will mix the colors on the paper by layering the washes on top of each other. You'll observe the difference between each technique and how the colors behave when mixing. You will also be able to practice water consistency and color ratio when mixing colors. Through this exercise, you will observe how the color mixing method differs from the layering method, noticing the different color results and the texture variation as you complete the chart. Then you'll learn about different watercolor techniques that you can use for various textures and visual effects. Regular wash, where you'll use a flat brush to overlap strokes and maintain a consistent water amount on your brush to evenly fill the box. Gradient, where you'll cover the top of the box with a layer of pigment with the least amount of water and slowly dilute the pigment on the palette to make the wash lighter as you go down the gradient. 2 color gradients, where you'll use the gradient technique on both the top and the bottom, choosing contrasting color combinations. Wet on wet, where you'll evenly wet the entire box with a clean brush with water. Choose a color and dilute it a little on the palette and put the color on different spots around the box and observe how the wet surface affects the spreading of the color, especially around the edges. Water drips on wet color, where you'll switch the order of paint and water layering, making a dark wet wash of color to fill the entire box. You will drop some clear water over the wash to observe how the water pushes the pigments away and create interesting textures on the surface. Dry brush, where you'll use dry strokes on dry paper, creating a scratchy and rough texture. Dry to wet, where you'll observe how the pigments behave differently on a dry surface and a wet surface. Glazing, where you'll experiment with the transparent nature of watercolor using a complementary color combination. Lining, where you'll practice controlling your brush strokes to create thin lines. Color drops on color pattern, where you'll use the nature of watercolor to create patterns and gradation in controlled areas. Then you'll learn about masking fluid, which is a latex-based liquid that you can apply to the paper to prevent the specific area from getting watercolor and save the white of the paper. You'll draw any random marks on the box with masking fluid. Apply a wash layer, and once your wash is fully dried, you can peel off the masking fluid using an eraser or your fingertip by gently rubbing them off from the paper. Masking tape is another alternative to masking fluid to preserve the white of the paper, especially for straight edges. Masking tape is most commonly used to cover the edges of the paper to create a nice clean frame around your painting. You'll wash the box with any dark color of your choice and then peel off the masking tape. The layered strips technique is another way to create patterns and create a different layered visual effect. You'll mix just enough water to the pigment to create appropriate dilution of the paint and draw a horizontal strip on top of the box. Wait for this layer to dry before putting on the second layer on top of it and observe how the layered area can mix colors differently. Then you'll do an exercise on a technique called scratching. First, preparing a light green wash with enough water to paint leaf shapes, mixing in darker green to the leaf shapes to give the color depth, then scratching the veins of the leaves with the end of your brush to create a dent on the paper so the pigments can flow in and create darker marks around those areas. Then, using the techniques brush lift and tissue lift, you will explore different ways to lift the watercolor washes to create different marks on the paper. Having learned different watercolor techniques to create various visual effects from watercolor painting, next you'll move on to the detailed paintings of various materials, starting with a painting of stones, then trees to learn about the painting of texture, the sky, going back and forth between the brush and tissue to make the cloud texture fluffy, then a tree to practice texture some more. Then a monochromatic landscape. For the monochromatic painting, you will paint a full landscape only with red, starting with a sketch. Then the underpainting. In the underpainting stage, you will lightly layer a gradient wash over the entire surface in order to provide a range of light mid-tones at the beginning of the painting. Then on to the mid-tone stage. Then when the mid-tone layer is dried, you'll move on to the dark tone stage. For the dark tone stage, you'll mix more pigment with less water on the palette to make the dark wash of red. And then lastly, the details. The final watercolor painting is a project that's a landscape painting in color. When you have added the final details around the painting, you're finished with the final project. With each section of the watercolor course, you'll become better and better at describing volume, light, and texture, and you'll start to make art portfolio pieces that you'll feel proud of submitting, work that really impresses admissions counselors at the top art schools. This watercolor course is an engaging, flexible, and accessible art course that will empower you to explore your creative potential and develop your watercolor painting skills at your own pace. And we'll send you the workbook and all the materials you'll need: a watercolor brush set, watercolor paint set, a watercolor pad, masking fluid, and a flat brush.
Want to learn art professionally but life gets in your way? Ashcan Art is just a click away. Get access to our structured curriculum packed with 4K videos and detailed guidance curated by our experienced instructors. All fully accessible on your terms. Join now at course.ashcanartlibrary.com. Let us be part of your creative journey.
Ashcan Art offers pre-college portfolio preparation courses year-round. Learn more about our courses at ashcanart.com and see accepted art portfolio examples on Instagram at ashcan.art. And please subscribe below for more art portfolio tips.